Hi, everyone. I'm Liz Whitehead, Managing Editor of Events at U.S. News and World Report. Today, we've gathered a panel of health industry leaders to examine some of the best approaches to solving the crisis of critical drug shortages. From a range of prescription and over-the-counter medications to vital cancer drugs, persistent shortages are having a big impact on providers and patients across the country. Our panel will discuss some of the innovative approaches, policy tools, and urgent actions needed to address this growing challenge. Before we turn to our panel, just a couple of housekeeping notes. We are recording video of today's webinar, and we'll be sharing a link with all registrants in the coming days. Video will also be archived on usnews.com. We are simulcasting today's program on the US News Facebook, LinkedIn, and YouTube channels. You can find more details about today's speakers, as well as a range of upcoming virtual events at usnews.com/events. We welcome your questions. As you may have them, please type them into the Q&A feature on your screen, and our moderator may give voice to some of them later in the hour. Now, I'm pleased to welcome our panelists. Tom Kraus, Vice President of the Office of Government Relations at the ASHP, the American Society of Health System Pharmacists. Dr. Midal Sutaria, Senior Vice President for Pharmacy Contract and Program Services at Vizient. Dr. Eric Tishy, Immediate Past Chair of the End Drug Shortages Alliance and Division Chair for Supply Chain Management at Mayo Clinic. And Dr. Kenny Yu, Systems Senior Director of Pharmacy Services in the Department of Pharmacy at NYU Langone Health. And now over to my colleague and U.S. News Managing Editor, Michael Morella, to lead the discussion. Michael?
Thanks so much, Liz, and thanks to you, Kenny, Eric, Midal, and Tom for making the time to be with us today. I'll jump right into it because there's a lot we want to cover. We just heard a little bit about each of you, your organizations, but I wonder if you could kind of briefly share a little bit more about your roles at your institutions. If we go around the horn. Kenny, perhaps we could start with you.
Sure. Thank you, Michael. As Liz pointed out, I'm the Systems Senior Director of Pharmacy Services at NYU Langone Hospitals in New York. We're a 5-hospital system with a standalone ED in Brooklyn, over 10 infusion centers. And my role is really as the department head for the pharmacy department that manages all or oversees all of the pharmacy services that include inpatient pharmacies, outpatient ambulatory pharmacies, our retail pharmacy, specialty pharmacy, the 340B program, investigational pharmacy, and anything that's pharmacy related for the organization.
How about you, Eric?
So hi, Eric Tishy. I am as I mentioned, responsible for the pharmaceutical supply chain for Mayo Clinic. And I think most importantly for this topic, I'm the immediate past chair of the End Drug Shortage Alliance, which is a multi-stakeholder organization made up of healthcare providers, manufacturers, distributors, and other sort of stakeholders in society that are focused on ending drug shortages.
Midal?
All right, good morning or good afternoon, everyone. Midal Sutaria. I manage all of our pharmacy sourcing or contracting services at Vizient. So I'm a pharmacy category lead that manages solutions that are around pharmacy, whether it's generic injectables or branded products, distribution, etc. Vizient is a healthcare performance improvement company. We work with our providers really to drive solutions that improve access for them and really help them manage their spend as well.
And Tom.
Yeah, thank you. I'm Tom Kraus. So I am from the American Society of Health System Pharmacists. So ASHP is the largest society of pharmacy professionals. We have about 60,000 members across the country. And they are pharmacists practicing in institutions including with some of the clinicians we have on the webinar today. One of the things we do that's unique in the shortage space is we've been in an association that's been tracking shortages for a number of decades. So we have a kind of good view into that history. My particular role is engaging with policymakers around these issues. I used to work on Capitol Hill and worked in the Food and Drug Administration. So that's my role.
Well, Tom, maybe we could stay with you actually, because I'd love to help set the scene for our audience about drug shortages and where they stand now. You know, what does the landscape look like today in March of 2024, especially compared to how things were a over the last several years of the pandemic.
Yeah.
And could you talk a little bit about some of the drivers of shortages, the perennial issues like quality control, shortages of key ingredients, that sort of thing?
Absolutely. Yeah. So right now we are really kind of at a peak of shortages. We're around 300, a little more than 300 active shortages today. But I don't want people to think this is a new problem. We've had over 200 active shortages for more than a decade. And a lot of times this hasn't been visible to patients. I think the pandemic and some of the infectious disease respiratory illnesses that have emerged since then have brought that to light, but this is not new. What most of these shortages are actually older drugs, particularly injectable drugs that are used in hospital procedures. It's not as visible to patients, but it has a big impact on patient care. They're usually relatively cheap drugs, believe it or not. The most common ones are central nervous system drugs. So that's going to be things like pain medications, anesthetics, anticonvulsants, antimicrobials, chemotherapies, IV fluids, and hormone therapies. And there's a few themes around kind of what the drivers are, and I'm sure we'll get into this in more detail. One is around just manufacturing quality problems. Something happens in the manufacturing process that's like identified by a manufacturer or by a regulator, the FDA or a foreign regulator, and it's a reason to stop production of that product. Another issue could be a supply chain disruption, an inability to access a key ingredient for that product. Or it can be another thing that impacts supply chain, like a natural disaster. For example, there was a Hurricane Maria in 2017, really disrupted manufacturing in Puerto Rico, which was actually a big hub of domestic manufacturing. Then you have just fundamental business decisions by manufacturers. As I mentioned, these are cheap products in most cases. And so, if a company has a manufacturing problem, they may make a decision that, we'd be better off manufacturing a different product. And that can create a gap in the market. That's a totally rational decision from their perspective, but it does disrupt access to that drug. And then the last thing I'd say as a theme is spikes in demand. This is not the norm, but it is real. So, recently we've seen this with ADHD drugs, antiviral drugs related to respiratory infections. At the beginning of the pandemic, when you had so many patients being mechanically ventilated, you needed an enormous amount of sedatives and anticonvulsants and painkillers. That's not the norm. But if you increase demand by several 100%, obviously you're gonna run into a shortage that the market's not able to manage. And then the last one is, I'm sure we can mention Ozempic. That's just a consumer-driven demand that the manufacturer honestly didn't kind of have the building blocks in place to support that. But that is, if people think that's the norm, I want to disabuse them of that. Most of these products are disrupted because of a manufacturing problem, a supply chain problem, or just a business decision because it's a low-margin product.
Thank you, Tom. Middle, I wonder if you could, please feel free to add on that. But I'd also love to ask, thinking about this, were there any efforts underway before the pandemic, or just because of this long-standing challenge that maybe got more visibility over the last couple of years that were underway that were making a difference and that are making a difference? Could you talk about that?
Yeah, absolutely, Michael. And Tom did a fantastic job just outlining the current landscape, but also describing that this is, several decade-old problem. We're not new to drug shortages, and we were already working on addressing and bringing forward solutions that would help our providers enhance access and really combat this challenge on a day-to-day basis. So one of the first steps we did back in 2019 at Vizient was, when you think about all the different categories of drugs that Tom just described, that's hundreds, if not thousands, of products and different types of presentations that are available in the market. So in order to address such a big challenge, we needed to really focus to really understand, where do we start? So the first step we did was we took a list of medication and we identified them as essential medications. These are products that have no alternatives or are really workhorses in an institution where without it, it would really be very challenging to manage the patients because it would require a lot of system changes, et cetera. And then we took that list and really focused on those products to create solutions and strategies that would enhance access. With that essential list, we made it public and we made it, we shared that with our providers, our suppliers, or manufacturers that we worked with. And we said, let's focus on these products and create enhanced access. And with that, we launched a solution called NOAA Plus Enhanced Supply, where we worked with the manufacturers to create additional inventory or buffer inventory in addition to what was already being purchased by the providers on a day-to-day basis. And as soon as we launched the program, 2 months later, we had a demand spike, which Tom actually described earlier in the pandemic, and one of the drugs was propofol. And because we were early into this program, we had about 2 months of inventory that we could tap into, and we were able to work with our providers and the manufacturer to provide over 650,000 units of additional inventory. Again, this, like Tom described earlier, there are times that we don't know what is going to cause the drug shortage, and especially in a challenge like this where you have a demand spike, you want to be better prepared. And having that inventory being available to tap into on U.S. shores, it's important for us and providers to be able to access that immediately. So with that, with that access, we understood that we needed to quickly grow the program because it worked. And that was during the pandemic that we were able to do that. So we really focused a lot of our efforts in growing this program over the last few years as well.
No, we'll want to hear some more about that. Thank you, Middle. Eric, I wonder if you could weigh in here and thinking about your role with End Drug Shortages Alliance. In terms of the drug supply chain, has the situation improved since the pandemic? Has it worsened? What can you tell us about sort of where things are now, and give your own perspective on some of these issues?
So I actually refer to this as the pandemic paradox, where we saw a little bit of a drop of drug shortages during the pandemic. And some of that was because there was suspension of some of the FDA activities around investigating manufacturers. And now that the pandemic is sort of long over, we've had a sort of resurgence of those inspections, and I think those quality issues are coming to light, and that's leading to some manufacturers closing down. And then, as we were coming out of the pandemic, there were also just strains that were put on the supply chain and changes of needs of products and things of that nature. So during the heat of the pandemic, we actually saw less shortages, and then now we're seeing more. And I think what this points to is that this is really a long-term problem. Tom mentioned that this is sort of a multi-decade issue, and you've had generation of healthcare providers now that have sort of practiced in an era where they're dealing with consistent shortages. And so our hope is that, we want to draw attention to this and some of the solutions so that we actually get some long-term fixes to these issues so we can drive down the number of shortages.
Can I just respond really quickly? Eric, one of the things that you mentioned, and I think it's important for folks to understand, is during the pandemic, FDA paused some of its foreign inspections. And now, now that we're through the sort of the bulk of the pandemic, they're going back and they're doing new inspections. And so they're uncovering quality manufacturing problems that were out there in the world. I don't want people to walk away with the impression that it's FDA's fault for doing an inspection that we have a shortage. They should be doing those inspections and they should be identifying those manufacturing problems. So I just want to make sure folks realize Eric is absolutely right that what will happen is they'll continue to identify problems in the manufacturing process out there in the world. Don't take away from that the solution is let's not do FDA inspections, right? Obviously, we need to be doing those.
And just to piggyback off of that, I think, we talk about drug shortages, and there's a whole slew of reasons why a drug shortage occurs that everyone pointed out, but the quality piece of it cannot be understated, I think. And whether that's a voluntary recall or involuntary recall, what have you, I think we do need to keep our eye on the prize on ensuring that our supply chain is intact, but the integrity of that and the quality of how we make the products is something that we emphasize, because if there's there's a chink in the armor there that really disrupts the whole industry. And then when you have a shortage because there's a quality issue in one manufacturer, that imposes more demand on the other ones to kind of pick up the slack in the marketplace. But then that also, what comes first, the chicken or the egg, right? And then you increase the demand from the providers to purchase more because they're afraid they're not going to have enough to take care of the patients. And so we really need to try to highlight the quality process. And again, it's not taking anything away from the FDA at all. And to Tom's point, we need to continue down this path of inspections and making sure everyone raises the bar on the expectation of how products are being made, so we can eliminate that issue from a drug shortage situation standpoint.
That's an important point, Kenny. And I wonder if you could also, before we drill down to some other solutions and possible solutions, talk about some of the specific impacts of shortages on patient outcomes and care delivery. I don't know if any specific examples come to mind, but we hear a lot of stories and that sort of thing, but I'd love to have your take. And again, others, please feel free to weigh in as well.
Yeah, like all my other colleagues highlighted, it's very important to note that drug shortages have been around forever. And I think that it's just become our daily living that we manage these problems on a day in and day out basis, right? And I think not every drug is created equally. I mean, Middle touched upon an essential drug list, which may be essential to one set of providers versus another. And so getting a common denominator has always been a nice debate between providers as well. And for us, when you think about a drug shortage, are there alternatives, right? And alternatives can mean different things. Do you have a different manufacturer creating the same presentation? Are you able to switch to that different manufacturer, and what does that supply chain look like? And then you peel the onion back from there. Or if there's only a handful that are out that with that same presentation, can you change the concentration, or is it a different drug within that class that you can switch over to? And then do you think about operational changes or clinical changes? And so I think the impact is real, but it varies, and the degree of impact is dependent on the type of drug and what the alternative is that you're able to secure. And I think one that we all lived through recently is the carboplatin and cisplatin shortage that we've been navigating. I think that has a real impact, although it may not be qualified as an essential drug list, as Middle pointed out, with that definition or parameters of, supportive care and supportive meds for the hospitals. But chemotherapy is technically essential. I mean, you have patients that are on therapy and you don't want to disrupt that. And so when we had the shortage, we really had to make decisions as to how do we provide the best possible care without disruption of care and not causing an issue with other patients who may need the drug. And with inventory issues for those two particular drugs, we needed to figure out a way of approving when patients would start therapy. We also didn't want to disrupt therapy. Are there viable solutions to different treatment plans? And so, it's a collaborative effort from everyone within the healthcare field to figure out what would be the best approach to make sure that every patient is treated equitably and ensuring that we're able to provide treatment to the patients.
Yeah, and I would just like to add that, all the challenges that Kenny described from a provider lens, whether it's managing the formulary, finding alternate presentation, changing the internal systems, communication, all of those have additional costs of managing drug shortages as well. Vizient actually did a survey back in 2019 to really understand what is it costing our providers and health systems to manage these drug shortages. And it costs over $360 million plus to manage these drug shortages on an annual basis, along with over 8 million in labor hours that go into managing those drug shortages too, which is significant, especially for the providers that are managing, costs and spend for and making sure that their priority really is to manage the patients, but now they're trying to manage the actual acquisition or access to those products instead.
Yeah, and then to piggyback off of that, and that's a very good point, Middle, that it doesn't get brought up enough, but also it's not, when we do make a switch, it's not just today we're doing one thing, tomorrow we do the next. There's a whole safety component that we need to worry about in terms of how the orders are built and treatment plans and ensuring the right safety parameters are in place for ordering and administration and storage and everything like that. So it's not as cut and dry as today we're buying product A, tomorrow we're going to use product B. I think there's a lot that goes on behind the scenes from a patient quality and safety standpoint, as well as all the operational things that Middle just pointed out and the cost to that.
Maybe just one more comment to help quantify the impact here. We did a survey of our members, and respondents indicated that a third of them indicated needing to ration, delay, or cancel treatments because of a drug shortage. So that is just to give you kind of a global sense of how this is impacting patients. That impact is real.
Yeah, and I'd like to, I kind of describe this as the high cost of low cost drugs. So when you have something, I think when we generally think of pharmaceuticals, a lot of people think that they're very expensive. But in the pharmaceutical industry, there are very high cost products, which are branded. And most of the shortages that we see are with low cost drugs. And I think the price that we pay if the products are too cheap is that the quality suffers, and then you have all these other problems. I think the members on the call talked a lot about the impact on healthcare operations and healthcare providers. This has a real impact on patients. So I had an experience this summer where I had a family member who was getting treated with carboplatin, and I remember sitting in the appointment with this relative and thinking to myself, well, I hope he's going to be able to get the standard of care. And I think when we're dealing with something like cancer, we all expect the best because it's a life-threatening issue. And the reality is that we're having to jump through all these hoops. And we're fortunate. Actually, the White House ended up having a session where they brought in a bunch of leaders, and Drug Shortage Alliance, we were part of that conversation. And the FDA allowed emergency importation of carboplatin, and that helped ease the issue. And so I think those are some of the creative solutions that we'd like to see used as well to address these issues, because we don't want patients to suffer and not receive the best quality care because of a shortage.
I'd love to stick with that point. Thank you, Eric. Certainly being mindful of providers and patients, consumers and those in the clinical setting. What are some of those innovations happening? You've mentioned a bunch of them, but some of the ways to kind of create a more resilient supply chain or be mindful of different alternatives, as you mentioned earlier, Kenny. I wonder if we could just if there are any specific examples you could point toward to illuminate us of things you're aware of or things that you're doing. Middle, maybe we could start with you. And I know you spoke a little bit about the enhanced supply program, but wonder if there's more you could tag on there. And again, feel free, the rest of the group, to chime in.
Yeah, absolutely, Michael. So as we learned, I'll go back to, our earlier example of the demand spike. And as we learned that this program can really provide that additional access during a market disruption, and regardless of where that market disruption comes from, whether it's a natural disaster or demand spike or a quality issue, how can we be better prepared? So we really looked at those essential products, and whether it's in the oncology space where, a lot of these chemotherapy protocols, there's not just an alternative you can plug in. Or if you do plug in an alternative, it causes demand on other products that are similar. And we need to be prepared for a potential demand increase there as well. So with that, we actually expanded our program to include more products in it. And today we work with our suppliers to hold up to 147 million additional units of these essential medications here in the United States. And Kenny and Eric mentioned some of the products like cisplatin, carboplatin, and others that are, critical and essential to these operations and making sure that patients get the access. And, we've been able to expand the program to make sure that our providers, when they do have these challenges, are able to ask for that access. And yes, we talk about the inventory being available in the United States, but how do we know that these products are being accessed? And that's what we're also tracking. So to date, under the program, we provided our members and others. In fact, I've worked with several health systems here too, which is Eric's Mayo as well as NYU, to provide access to these products. Over 3.5 million units for various products that we provided into the market. And we're continuing to do that. We're continuing to expand the product. And the way we do that, and the solution works because there has to be a value for all stakeholders, right? Providers have to get access to the product. That's essential because, like Eric described, these are low-cost drugs, but in order to, if we are saying that we might pay a higher price to get that access, we have to be assured that that access is there and the product is available when you need it. Also, we have to make sure that our suppliers are brought in and there's a value there too. And how do we create that value? They need the commitment because they're planning their production several years in advance. So how do we leverage that type of a commitment so that the supplier has assurance and can plan and manage that production years on out, source their raw materials, and manage those sites and provide those products, create that additional buffer inventory so we're ready in case there's a disruption that occurs. And then obviously, being able to bring that value together is a key component, and being able to make sure that there is commitment from the provider side along with a commitment and a resiliency and redundancy measures that the supplier or manufacturer also has to provide that continuous access during the disruption as well.
About technology and data-driven tools, AI, advanced manufacturing. I don't know if any of you or several of you could kind of speak to that as well as opening up doors and possibilities to maybe be proactive and resilient in the future for predicting shortages or looking for those alternatives where drug A is not available but option B might be. Tom, I don't know if you want to weigh in on that.
Yeah, well, I'm going to let Eric and Kenny kind of speak to the substitute product question in particular, yeah. But I do think there are some things that, as purchasers of product, health systems and GPOs can do, but it requires partnership with manufacturers, right? So right now, it is very difficult for us to make purchasing decisions on anything other than price, right? We are in general highly incentivized to buy the cheapest product. Eric was mentioning some of this challenge. As a purchaser, it's very hard for us to know, does this manufacturer only have one main supplier of API, and are they in China? Do they have some diversity in their supply chain that's going to create redundancy? We can't see those things. So having, number one, just asking those questions and pushing on manufacturers to provide that some of that information would be one step. I think it's going to require the government to intervene to get some of those data. But that would be one thread. I mean, there are some backstops in the system. It was mentioned that FDA can allow emergency importation of products during a shortage. They can also allow what are called compounding pharmacies to basically make what I would call like a small batch version of a product. But those are stopgaps. Those aren't scalable solutions. So those are the kinds of things that health systems can look to, but we really need a larger fix to those economic challenges.
One thing I'll throw out there is, Michael, from a technology standpoint, one of the challenges is really coordination, because with some of these products, there technically is enough drug in the supply channel, if you will, or in the country, and it doesn't necessarily get allocated to the locations that need it. Sometimes it's really, who's sort of the quickest at making the purchases or who has the financial wherewithal to have sort of a stockpile. I think the ADHD medications is a good example where there are these quotas that are in place to prevent abuse of the products. However, there's really poor coordination and information to ensure that those drugs are getting to the patients that need them. And we see this with other shortages as well. A very low-tech solution that I've seen helpful is there is a patient advocacy group that is a board member of the End Drug Shortage Alliance called Angels for Change, and they will actively, on behalf of patients, go and advocate and find product and help provide some visibility so the product can be moved around. And it's kind of low tech. I can see where technology would be very helpful if we had some transparency and access. Then you can sort of move products around. And, does that maybe need to be a government agency? It's very possible. I know that the Biden administration has allocated some money for sort of a coordinating body. And I think, that's a solution that we need to look at a little bit more deeply.
I think the common thread, or the key takeaways from what everyone's saying is that, number one, we need the data. Number two, we're all in it together. So we have to have a conversation with all stakeholders. And then number three is the coordination piece of it, right? I think that, one example I'll give is that you may think that you're diversifying with your product selection if you have 5 manufacturers that you're purchasing from, but if 4 of the 5 rely on one place for the API, you're effectively only having 2 viable solutions. And so understanding all of that is very helpful. And I think this is where technology comes into play. If we can funnel all this data, we can leverage predictive analytics and AI to kind of see where we may have some vulnerabilities in the supply chain, and then build some more redundancy to kind of help with those potential issues. Because, like as Middle pointed out, a disruption in supply chain is a disruption in supply chain. Doesn't matter if it's a quality issue, if it's natural disaster, bankruptcy, what have you. You're effectively, at the end of the day, you're pulling out X percentage out of the market. So how do we create some redundancies to make sure we can fill that gap? And or how do we ramp up and be nimble enough to ramp up quickly and expeditiously to fill that gap, and understanding that it takes 6, 9, 12 months for certain products to be checked and able to be down the assembly line and commercially available. We need to understand all that as a group to figure out how we can be nimble and where we can insert ourselves. And so I think, again, I can't emphasize enough that we're all in it together. The data and the coordination is very key. And Eric pointed out the transparency of that. And I think if we all got together to talk through all of it, then that's a step in the right direction for sure.
Tom did a nice job of pointing out earlier that, we need the FDA to do inspections. And I would also point out around this coordination issue, to me, it's not an FDA responsibility. It's not part of the FDA mission. And when I think of the FDA, the FDA is the Food and Drug Administration, and we don't have food shortages, and we have food that's pretty inexpensive and accessible. But what's the difference with food and drugs? Well, one of them is that for food, you have the U.S. Department of Agriculture that's very strategic, and it does things to support, production of food, and it looks down, 6, 12, 18, 24 months to make sure that we are meeting the needs of the marketplace and supporting farmers if there's, prices that are not sustainable for their business. I do see that when we talk about this coordination, we need something acute when there's a shortage, but then also some long-term strategic things where maybe we invest in specific manufacturers, or when we see that there's a problem, someone can talk to another manufacturer so that they can ramp up production and do that in a time frame where there's enough time for a manufacturer to pick up the pace.
Yeah, we're just kind of responding to Eric and Kenny. You're right. I think this is a yes and situation. We need the buffer supply in the short term. We need the coordination, but we also need the ability to ramp up manufacturing. Advanced manufacturing practices can do that. There are manufacturing practices that are a little more flexible that allow manufacturers to transition between products, but it's still a slow process. And that assumes that they're already approved to manufacture that drug, right? So this is not a blink of an eye to turn a manufacturer from one product to another. You need kind of a warm manufacturing base that already has the regulatory approvals in place, already has a supplier network in place, and has the ability to sort of in the medium term ramp up production while we use these other solutions like stockpiles to fill short-term gaps.
And I'll just add on the comment that Kenny made just more specifically on like AI and information and the level of transparency we can get related to where the product is made, how many suppliers make that product, and then, are all the suppliers utilizing the same API manufacturer, or is everyone procuring their glass vials and rubber stoppers from the same supplier, right? If there's it's not just the raw materials, but it's other materials that go into making that product as well that are just as important. But really understanding what products are the most vulnerable and most challenging, and then utilizing the additional technologies or nearshoring or onshoring to really target those products, and also understanding where is that geographic concentration? Is that product more vulnerable? Those are the ways that we can utilize it, because obviously having that information, like Eric described, 6 to 12 to 18 months ahead of time, we can be better prepared in delivering those solutions to not only reacting, but proactively preparing for any type of disruption. That it doesn't just lead to providers having to purchase more in case there is a disruption, because that's what generally happens once you have that information out in the market, and when you understand that there might be a supply challenge coming, then you get pockets of areas where there might be supply, but it's not in the right areas. But how can we be more proactive in addressing that and managing that, so that we manage the allocation of those products based on the historical purchases and not overwhelm or under-provide or over-provide any of the systems either. So just utilizing those tools and resources so that we can be better prepared and better manage any disruption that might come our way as well.
Yeah, as we're talking about preparing and kind of anticipating potential challenges, one role that I think this coordination role of government that Eric mentioned, one area that really is needed is some consideration of geopolitical risks. That's not a main driver of shortages historically. There have been examples. During the COVID-19, you did see countries clamp down on export, and that was problematic in some instances. But there is a real national security risk there when our manufacturing of products and APIs in particular is incredibly highly concentrated, particularly in potentially adversarial countries. That is a challenge we need to be thinking about at a policy level.
Let's stay with policy for a moment, and maybe again start with you, Tom, but broaden it out. We actually have a question from someone in our audience who asks, can you speak to lobbying efforts to incentivize domestic production? What's response been like there? And I'd love, if just in a couple of examples, we could talk about some of the other kind of policy approaches or mechanisms that might be worth paying attention to for this audience if they're not familiar with them already.
Yeah, I'm happy to kind of address both. With regard to domestic manufacturing, there's certainly a lot of interest from policymakers there. There has been an effort by the Department of Health and Human Services to figure out what products are manufactured abroad, what could be domestically manufactured. There are bills in Congress that propose to incentivize domestic manufacturing. I guess a word of caution here is domestic manufacturing is good. I'm not going to stand here and say we wouldn't want domestic manufacturing. Of course we would, but it is not necessarily a solution in and of itself, right? Think about the hurricane I mentioned in Puerto Rico. That was domestic manufacturing, but if a hurricane hits your manufacturing sites, they still go down even if they're domestic, right? What actually provides a level of robustness in a supply chain is diversity, right? Diversity in where you're getting those supplies from. And that's the kind of thing that we'd love to see incentivized. I think there are a few things that government can do to both provide the backstop and do some of this forward-looking thinking. Number one, encourage that transparency that we were talking about. We need visibility into the supply chain, kind of some way for purchasers of product to have greater visibility, whether it's through FDA sharing information or manufacturers being required to share information. We need visibility in the supply chain so we can identify where are there problems, where are there duplicate suppliers. We need to know those kinds of things. Some kind of subsidy for programs like Middle was describing, where the government can help us finance a buffer supply. This is not a small undertaking, especially for imagine a small rural hospital. You've got to keep the lights on. You're not focused on building a stockpile of medication. So if we're going to do that at scale, we need the government to provide support. And then, things like providing incentives for longer term contracts that with some guarantee of supply and a penalty when that doesn't occur, right? That's helpful to the provider and the patient because they know they're going to get supply. But it can also be helpful to the manufacturer because they know I'm not going to get undercut on price and I have some guaranteed volume for a period of time. And I think there are members of Congress who are actively thinking about this. I'll just give one shout out to the chairman and ranking member of the Senate Finance Committee, Senator Wyden and Senator Crapo. They are actively thinking about exactly these issues, and I'm really heartened to see that is a bipartisan and thoughtful effort.
Just picking up on that thread, I think that, we definitely don't want the audience to think that the government's not, this is not a situation that's not front and center or top of mind for them, because it is, and there are subsidies, some grants and funding that's available if you did want to bring manufacturing domestically. And Eric and I or our organizations are founding members of Civic RX, and I think that they've done a tremendous job of helping us with the essential med list and opening up the conversation across industries to help resolve the drug shortage situation. And so I yes, I think we're all in it together, and I do think that we do need help, but it's not to say that there isn't help out there. I think we just need to keep pulling on a thread together to see how we can continue to move forward together.
And I would add into a couple of areas that Tom described, but some of the efforts that are already underway. One of the areas that we talked about earlier is how do providers distinguish between the products, right? Today, maybe it's really the price that they can compare, especially in the generic injectable space. How do you go beyond that? How do you figure out, which product you could potentially be purchasing? And I think additional efforts by FDA on the quality management maturity, the QMM program that is underway, I think that's incredible. Some of those efforts that can help us really differentiate the marketplace and help us understand what is a reliable access in the future when you have that level of commitment will be important. And the discussion that's happening right now and how to support providers when if there are additional solutions that are brought to market that is potentially going to cost more, whether it's domestic manufacturing, whether it's automation, continuous manufacturing, if that potentially will cost more than having a product that might cost less, how do we subsidize that so that providers are then encouraged to utilize programs, et cetera, that will utilize those technologies and can fund that? So like Tom described earlier, the efforts that are underway that are discussing potentially having add-on payments or subsidizing these programs like this, where it creates additional resiliency measures. And like I would say, it's not one program, it's not one solution. We heard others describe other solutions in the marketplace, which is why this is a pretty significant problem. It's continuing to grow with over 300 drug shortages today. How do we bring the entire industry together to address it? And Eric described the End Drug Shortages Alliance earlier too, where we knew at Vizient we weren't the only ones that were going to solve drug shortages. There are other industry stakeholders, whether it be suppliers, providers, other solutions in the market. How do we bring them all together under one umbrella? And the End Drug Shortages Alliance aims to do exactly that. So we're very encouraged by that as well.
Yeah, let's stay with that theme, Middle. Thank you for bringing us there. I think a lot of you have mentioned the cross-stakeholder situation. We've talked about policy a little bit, but in terms of things like the End Drug Shortages Alliance and Civica, which you mentioned, some in our audience might be familiar with Mark Cuban's Cost Plus Drugs company, which just this month announced its first hospital partner. Are there any insights or recent developments that you'd want to point our audience toward about some of these, again, cross-stakeholder alliances and efforts? And Eric, maybe I'll ask you to start in terms of giving a sense of, again, what some of this collaboration is really demonstrating or moving us towards.
Well, I think there's a couple themes here. So one is we've talked about how the government can help, and to some extent, I think the government likes to see when multiple stakeholders get together and say, hey, we all agree on this solution, rather than just sort of pointing fingers at each other. So to me, that's one of the goals of doing this cross-organizational and cross-sector collaboration. The other thing I'll point to is, even with the CARES Act, the government did provide some money for some domestic manufacturing. Flow Pharmaceuticals is another example of an organization that received some funding to bring production of active pharmaceutical ingredient to the United States. And it does take a long time to build up, a brand new manufacturer. So, the CARES Act, it's hard to believe it's almost 4 years ago. And so, I think we're just starting to see some, things become available because of that. And so, and then I think Civica is a good example of where healthcare organizations said, hey, we need to do something about this. They banded together, got the organization off the ground, and then the government provided some additional funding. So, in some ways, the government's really good at sort of, writing a check. And so if some private organizations get together and start getting something off the ground, the government can sort of boost those efforts. But those are some things that I've been involved with in that aspect.
I think that the diversity of solutions, it should be encouraged. I think in itself that helps us move the needle a little bit more. And I keep saying we're all in it together, and we need this cross-functional collaboration. And so we're all on the same team here in the spirit of patient care and ensuring that everyone gets treated equitably and safely and timely, right? And so I think that with all these different quote unquote solutions coming out, whether that's through Vizient or Civica or Cost Plus or what have you, we should all be cheering one another on instead of looking at it as competition, and say, like, listen, here's another thread or another avenue we can explore to help with the redundancy or diversity of solving this problem. And I think as we continue to work together on that, we will have multiple solutions to help build the resiliency of the supply chain for drug shortages, and incrementally will be better tomorrow because of it.
Yeah, I absolutely agree, Kenny. I think you hit the nail on the head. We always say, like, rising tides lifts all boats, because we think about all these solutions that are all working together to address drug shortages, whether they're working together or independently, but they're solving for drug shortages, whether it's, getting more transparency into the marketplace, whether we're onshoring or nearshoring, or whether we're looking at buffering additional inventory, but it's making the supply chain more resilient. And that's the end goal. How are we better prepared? How do we manage these proactively rather than reactively? And, if these solutions are looking to address that, we absolutely applaud all those efforts in doing so too. Yeah.
I think everything that everyone's saying is right. And I like these concepts of kind of working together to address the problems. But I do want to throw a little bit of mud here for just a second, because Eric mentioned that the CARES Act. The CARES Act did some good things to address shortages. In fact, many of us worked to advocate for that legislation. And one of the things that it did was require some additional transparency, not the level that I would like to see, but just some basic information about who's experiencing a shortage and, like, what is driving that shortage. And FDA has reported that half of manufacturing sites have actually not been complying with that level of transparency. That's a problem, right? We need some commitment to transparency, at least for the laws that we already have on the books. We need FDA to have some enforcement authority to really require that.
We've got, a little over 10 minutes left, so I want to try to squeeze in a number of questions if we can. One from someone in our audience. This person asks, what recommendations do you have for how consumers can support you and can support this cause in terms of addressing drug shortages? Eric, you mentioned that organization just as an example earlier. I don't know if you or anyone wants to just kind of chime in on anything specifically for consumers, patients, families, that sort of.
I think one thing is consumers could support some of these organizations that are advocating for, drug shortages to be resolved. They can help their policymakers, their legislators understand that this is an important issue to them. And then another thing is when they're making purchases, even personally, panic buying, I think, is a challenge, and it contributes. That you have a scarcity mindset, and that can lead to shortages. Consumers see that. We see the same thing in healthcare, where organizations start scrambling for supply. So I think if we can all just sort of step back and take sort of what we need, that would go a long way too, at least with those acute issues.
I think one of the most important things that consumers can do, just patients in their course of their treatment, is, if you're comfortable with it, share your story, share the experience, right? This is the reality of advocating with policymakers, particularly members of Congress, is they respond to these kind of emotional pleas from their constituents. And so if you're a provider who has a patient that's struggling to access medication, or you're a patient yourself or a family member, you can, I know it's intimidating, but you can find the phone number of your member of Congress and call them and say, hey, this is a real problem. Potentially my health or my life is at risk. Really force them to say what they're going to do to address that. That is something that they owe you as a policymaker. And you'd be surprised how much impact you can have when you do that. I have personally seen members of Congress wake up to this issue because someone in their life has a real experience that drives it home for them.
That's why I shared that personal experience that I had earlier today, because drug shortages don't discriminate. Anyone can have a health issue, and you can end up in a situation where your, treatment plan is being adjusted because drug products are not available. And that's really not a fun situation to be in. And the thing about life is no one gets out alive. So we're all going to have some kind of health issue that's going to come for us at some point, or one of our family members. So, it really is incumbent. And so I agree with Tom, share those stories where you've been personally impacted, or if you've had a family member who's been impacted.
Michael, I'll just add in, just from a provider standpoint, and a lot of what Eric and Tom shared around how can we encourage consumers to do that, but from a broader standpoint, just leveraging some of the visibility we have from a data standpoint, and working with the End Drug Shortages Alliance. One of the cancer products that is really a gold standard of treatment for bladder cancer is in short supply today, and it's been for several years. So one of the things that we're able to do is put that type of patient impact lens on it by looking at what has been the gap in the market for those units. And then as you look through the years, there is changes in utilization, there is changes in additional diagnosis that might happen. So what is the increase in demand year over year, and how do we project that demand to be in the future years too, to identify that market gap, and then really understand if that is the market gap, how many patients are going without that type of gold standard of treatment today. So for that specific drug, we understand today, and we've been able to publish that under the End Drug Shortages Alliances, there's 150,000 vials annually that are short or not available, right? And that impacts over 8,300 patients on a yearly basis that might not be getting the optimal care. So those are the types of things that we can do from a broader standpoint too, to really hone in on what is the patient-specific impact. But absolutely, when you look at it from an individual's perspective, and sharing those stories can definitely elevate that as well.
Sometimes there are things that patients or providers can do to help themselves too. I don't want to put the burden of this on patients or providers, but sometimes a medication that is not available from one pharmacy or one provider will be available from another, just by virtue of what distributor they work with. Did that distributor have access to a supplier? Maybe the other distributor didn't. Sometimes you can access product. And I would just, for folks, especially the providers, if they didn't hear the organization that Eric mentioned, Angels for Change, they are very effective at finding product. You can reach out to them and ask them to help you identify product for a patient. But again, that is not a substitute for policy solutions.
I want to talk about drug pricing and costs too. Again, someone else in our audience asks the question, how do you balance costs versus quality? Huge, difficult question, I know. Kenny, I don't want to put you on the spot, but maybe, I don't know if you could kind of weigh in a little bit on that, and minding that this person asks also, aggressive contracting with generic manufacturers can sometimes push them to cut unprofitable products or reduce adherence to quality, that kind of a thing. So any insights you could share there? And again,
yeah, I think Tom mentioned this earlier, is that it's kind of counterintuitive, right? Because we're tasked to be fiscally responsible, as and we're supposed to be, and so we're tasked to pick the cheapest product because it's supposed to be, or the least expensive product because we want to be responsible with our funds. At the end of the day, we don't have the insights or the transparency into quality of manufactured products on the buying level right now. I think we should be moving towards that to understand if manufacturers have had issues in the past or what have you. And if that's front and center, that allows us to make more educated decisions as to maybe we will spend a little bit more knowing that product A has been recalled 3 times in the last 3 years or something along those lines, right? And so having that information available at our fingertips will go a long way. I know Eric touched upon this earlier too, is like if it's if a product is too cheap, is that sustainable, right? And I think that there are entrants into the market or manufacturers who enter the market to try to grab market share, and then they undercut the price, and that's not sustainable. But then if there are 5 competitors on there and 3 of them decide, well, we can't compete, we're just gonna exit the market, then that also will change the landscape and shortly thereafter. And then does that increase the price later on because now instead of having 5 competitors, you have 1 or 2? And so I think that I don't have a good answer on balancing that today, but I do know that if we had more accessible information on the front line, that can help drive conversation as to what's a sustainable price. I think there was a paper that was published actually, if quality does not really cost a lot more. And I think that if we go for a quality product and we know it's really not going to be incrementally that much more expensive compared to a very, very cheap or inexpensive product.
There are some examples in the market of people paying a premium for some stability. Like there are examples of health systems that work with manufacturers in these kind of long-term contract arrangements where they have some certainty around supply and a buffer, and the manufacturer has some certainty around long-term volume, and they know they're not going to get undercut on price. But that costs money, right? So if we're going to expect everyone to do that, we probably need the government to somehow finance that kind of an arrangement.
And I'll just add in that, I would like to describe like maybe the concept of pricing stewardship as we think about this, right? And we're all responsible. And when we think about the stewardship across the industry, we look at, any product that a provider is trying to purchase. Right now, there is really lack of visibility as to if you are going to pay more, what are you paying for? And being able to say that, yes, you're paying for that enhanced access, and being able to say that, yes, if you're paying more, you have this reliability and you have this additional opportunity to tap into a supply that might not be available. That's one way to say, here's redundancy, resiliency that we built in because there is a paying more. How do you differentiate that from a quality standpoint? I think that's where the gap exists in the marketplace today, is how do we have a standardized method in the industry for allowing the purchasers or providers to really understand how are they to differentiate between the products when they do have pricing stewardship. But absolutely, as we look at the programs that I described earlier, we practice that even within that, as in how do we manage that? If it is Kenny mentioned, if there are suppliers that are under a situation where there are increased costs, how do we manage those agreements where we do allow for those price increases? Because having a product is very important, because our providers could have the lowest price but no product. That doesn't do any good for the patient, right? So having the good storage of the supply chain and really managing that from a pricing stewardship standpoint is what we would say that we need to encourage.
I want to sneak in one 30-second response to an audience question before we turn to a final thought from each of you. I am a certified pharmacy technician, and it's us that deal with patients and their health concerns. Do you have any suggestions for the providers or pharmacists dealing directly with patients on these shortages? We talked a little bit about that, but again, anyone have a quick comment on that before we close it out?
I would just say that communication is important, right? And one of the areas that we definitely see, like as we communicate, whether with the providers or the patients, with Vizient, we look at providing not only the challenges and here's the drug shortage, but also here are the alternatives that you can potentially utilize. Here's the drug shortage mitigation strategy. very similarly, if there are patient conversations you have to have, if there is additional information that you have available as to here's the supply chain challenge. This is why we need to switch your therapy, etc. That, I mean, I'm just like thinking about it from a pharmacist lens, as I practiced in that area before. Just having that patient communication, I think, is important to be able to share what are the details that you're aware of, what are the options for them, and outlining that, providing them a choice there if there is one.
Thank you. We're at time, but I do want to just give you each an opportunity to talk about something we missed or something else you want to kind of highlight or reaffirm. Tom, maybe we could start with you.
Yeah, I think the main thing is we know what some of the challenges are, the biggest challenges, right? It's around quality, it's around supply chain. We need ways for purchasers to get visibility into that, and we need policy solutions that support things like buffer supplies that Mittal was mentioning, and long-term contracts that support some reliability in our supply chains.
Eric?
I just want to remind everyone this is a multi-decade problem, and we really need to take some actions to resolve this, because I don't want to be having the same conversation 5 years from now and saying, oh, it's actually worse now than it was even 5 years ago. But we do need to be strategic about these solutions and start to move forward with some of them.
Mittal?
First of all, I want to say thank you for the opportunity to have this discussion. Like we said, it is a long-term problem, but the fact that we are having these discussions and that it is getting in the forefront of all the topics today, I think that's very encouraging. Having all the solutions in the marketplace that are coming up, and having an alliance that brings those solutions together and being able to work collaboratively with the industry is exactly what we need at this point to address this type of a problem.
Any final word from you?
Yeah, I can't emphasize enough that we're all on the same team here, and we need to continue the conversation together collaboratively and transparently, so we can try to really end drug shortages down the road. And to Eric's point, it'll be a failure if we were sat together 5 years from now having the same conversation, because we do have some great momentum built up together right now, and we just need to continue to move that needle as one team.
Well, I want to thank you all for being part of this team today and for all the work that you do on these efforts. Tom Kraus, Mittal Sutaria, Eric Tishy, and Kenny Yu, thanks for being with us today. Thank you to those in our audience who asked great questions. And if you want to learn more about our speakers or future events, please visit us at usnews.com/events. Thanks again for your time today.
Thank you.